So, we're back finally after a bit of a hiatus. A few months just while we both got a bit busy, I think, and needed a break in any case. So, we're back with a new series, hopefully, which I'm calling the Silmarillion Sessions. Hopefully that's not too corny for people, but I think it will, get across what we're doing and the point of these podcasts, point of this series. So we're going to be having a look, as the title suggests, at the Silmarillion itself, the book that was published in 1977. And we're going to be reading through that in a series of podcasts, sort of a chapter at a time, although some podcasts we will read several chapters, especially towards the beginning of the book, where the chapters are usually quite short. And once we get to the sort of the great tales, so-called, we'll probably spend a few podcasts on each one because they deserve attention. And this is the first of those of our podcasts on the Silmarillion. So today we'll be looking at the letter at the start of the book, start of the second edition anyway, which was written by Tolkien to Milton Waldman, an erstwhile publisher of the book, who actually didn't publish the book. So we'll talk about that. And then we will be looking at the Ainulindalë, the creation story today, and we'll be thinking about the implications of that. So I think this should be fun. Obviously, a few other podcasts have Silmarillion, read-throughs as well. So we just wanted to add to that. But we'll be bringing our own perspective, of course, to that. And hopefully that'll be of interest to people. And it's lovely to be able to read through the Silmarillion again. I've been reading through a few of the early chapters, and it's a great way to get into, perhaps the theology of Tolkien's vision, which we'll be talking about. So, broadly construed. So I guess before we begin, Shrita, have you actually read this before? Or I'm with Shrita, by the way. I should have said that to start with. But have you read this before, or is this the first time that you're reading through it?
I've read this through once before when I was probably sometime in middle school.
Okay. Yeah.
Sometime around then, I don't remember. Maybe early high school. So, 15 years ago or so, 15, 16 years. And since then, I've maybe read a story, here or there, like, just sort of snippets of it. And I remember at the start of this project, I read the letter once. I don't remember why. Maybe we had talked about it some other time, but for some reason I just read it. And then I read it again, just, for this time through. So, so I'm looking forward to actually reading it sort of in adulthood, and it'll be good to read it with you, because I'm sure you'll bring a host of insight to it that was way over my kid head.
Oh, well, we'll see. That is yet to be determined, I guess. But yes, hopefully this will be interesting, and I'm sure we'll both bring insight to it.
And what about you? Are you steeped in this stuff, or have you read it just a few times? What's there?
Look, I've probably read it more than is advisable. No, I mean, I have read it a few times, yes. Simply because, of course, it's part of this universe, or part of this literary project, if you want, that I'm obviously quite enamored with. So yes, I've read it a few times. Having said that, each read through is, sort of brings in something new to it. So I'm very pleased to be able to just read through it again. Always, happy to find an excuse. So I guess we need to start with some background. So, of course, the Silmarillion, well, I don't know if you know this, but the Silmarillion has a bit of a reputation for density, I guess, for being quite a difficult read. And I think approaching this as an adult, as you said, is probably the best way to do it. Whilst The Hobbit, of course, is a children's book, at least in some sense. It can be read by adults, but it's certainly approachable by children. And of course, The Lord of the Rings is something that you can pick up, I guess, as an adolescent maybe, but rewards rereading as an adult as well. I think the Silmarillion really requires some maturity to approach properly. You mentioned that you read it in middle school. And I think, in my experience anyway, it can often be difficult for people of that age, or indeed any age. If you go onto Reddit and have a look at a lot of discussions around the Silmarillion there, it's like, I'm finding this difficult. How do I get through this? And everyone chimes in with advice, make a list of names, have a map, etc. So we may have to do that. I don't know. We'll see how we go with all the elves named with a name beginning with F.
You can start making spreadsheets.
Yes, making spreadsheets.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Just real quick, I think it's a trap. That's kind of sad because you can be a kid and sort of read The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, depending on which one you get to first, and you really like it, and then you think, oh, I want more, and then you read again like The Hobbit. Like I think I read The Lord of the Rings first, and then I read The Hobbit, and I was like, oh, I want more of this. So then I sort of looked around and was like, what's some more of this? And I saw the Silmarillion and I picked it up, and I do remember that I made it through the book, but honestly, I think I just hit a brick wall of comprehension. There were just large chunks that I was like, the words are going to go through me, but nothing is happening upstairs. So,
yeah, no, that's fair.
I think that's a trap that I'm sure a lot of kids have fallen into.
I mean, in my mind, I think if you're a sophisticated reader, that is, if you read widely, I don't think the Silmarillion should present too much of a problem. So you are definitely that. So I think you'll be fine.
Yeah, I hope.
And I think that the book does demand, attention and concentration, but so do many other difficult books. So, I'm sure that's not going to be an issue. But in its style and substance, it is, of course, more like in some parts a chronicle maybe, but in other parts, perhaps a saga or something. For reasons we'll talk about, it obviously apes, or it is inspired by various genres of medieval literature and even classical literature as well, perhaps. So it doesn't read like a novel. It's not a novel. So it does present the reader with a different set of conventions that one doesn't find in the novel. And I think people, especially critics, have struggled perhaps to understand what the point of such a project would be. Why write a work that is a kind of fake epitome of fake history for a fake past? Of course, I use the word fake sort of ironically there because, of course, the fantasy genre, as we now know, is a huge business, and so people quite enjoy reading about so-called fake histories. But, I still think that the Silmarillion is fairly unique in fantasy literature, if we want to group it, as is conventional with that. Usually fantasy literature today is composed of novels, of course, as you might find in any other genre. It just, those novels just happen to be set in a sort of fantastical world. But Silmarillion is something else, and I think part of what makes it interesting is also the its structure, its form, as we've talked about, or as I've mentioned. So that'll be something which we'll talk about as well.
I'll also just say real quick that the accusation that it's a sort of made up history or like a made up mythology for a made up history is kind of weak, because that's kind of what all mythology is, right? It's
Well,
there's no mythos that kind of deals with the quote unquote real world in an accurate way, right? It's, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of feel that this is as legitimate as any other kind of myth, any other kind of creation myth. It just happens to be one that was created more in modern times, but it's not like the Hindu creation myth has any better grasp on reality than this one. It's just that maybe at the time that the Hindu reality, that the Hindu creation myth came into being, that was the best explanation that they had, so they thought it was real. Whereas Tolkien is very aware that it's not. And in some ways, it maybe it has a better grasp on reality than our time-honored myths. So that's something it has going for it.
There's so much there. Yeah, I mean, perhaps. I mean, of course, the difference is that this is a creation of a single individual, which is itself quite extraordinary, I suppose.
Yeah.
And many people have commented on that he was sort of able to generate a facsimile of sort of cultural myth, sort of in his own mind, and then of course develop it over his lifetime. But yeah, I mean that's certainly true, and of course that gets to the point of what myth is and what it's meant to communicate, how literally we should take it, and questions like that. Even myths in the past, or as they were thought of in the past. But I think it raises some interesting questions.
Yeah.
So that's really the idea of this podcast, and hopefully this will be accessible to people who haven't even read the Silmarillion, although I should say that we'll always be talking and discussing it as though you've already read it or read the relevant chapters. So there will, always be spoilers, if you want to put it that way. It'll just be assumed that you've read the relevant chapters. But if any of our listeners haven't read it yet and want to follow along, of course, that's possible as well. And I'll post, usually on the Twitter account for this podcast, the chapters that we're looking at for those who may be interested. So, yeah, it's designed hopefully for people who are just interested in the text and want to sort of dive into it in a bit more depth. So with that, I guess we can sort of begin. And actually, I did want to very briefly, more preliminary material, sorry, briefly go over the textual history, just because I think that's important for context, and we will come back to that as we discuss the book going forward. So, of course, the Silmarillion was published in 1977 in the first edition and 1999 in the second edition, and it was compiled by Christopher Tolkien, mostly out of the edition or the edition of the text that was written in the 1950s by Tolkien, about 1951. So around the same time that he was writing The Lord of the Rings. However, that was unfinished, of course, like most things Tolkien wrote. So Christopher Tolkien had to supplement it with material from various other writings that Tolkien had completed, particularly materials of, what some scholars have called the sort of annal tradition or annalistic tradition in Tolkien's writing. That is more of a sort of chronology tradition. And he wrote several of these sort of chronologies, sort of which go year by year, as you would imagine. And a lot of these are quite complex, though they really sort of tell narrative stories. So you can sort of use that material to really supplement the unfinished sort of work, and that's more or less what Christopher did in composing the text, in composing the Silmarillion in its published form. So the Silmarillion in its published form is not a product of Tolkien himself, in a sense. I say in its published form. It is a product of his son's editorial work. Now, I don't have a problem with that. I think this Silmarillion is more or less the Silmarillion that we would have gotten had Tolkien completed it around the time of The Lord of the Rings. It is not the Silmarillion that we would have got had Tolkien completed it 20 years later, because as we've seen in the recent volume, The Nature of Middle-earth, he was reconsidering a whole lot of things, a whole lot of sort of features in the Legendarium, and I have a lot to say about that. And hopefully soon I'll be doing a sort of joint review of that volume with Daniel Stride, who I've interviewed before, who indeed was my first interviewee. And Daniel, as you might remember, is a great blogger on Tolkien at his blog Foolish Fellow, which I've got linked in the show notes for that first interview, so you can have a look at that if you want. But hopefully we'll be at some point soon doing a joint sort of review of that and discussing the book. The reason it's taking so long is because I have the book, I ordered it from Britain, but it has apparently taken quite some time to get to the Antipodes. He's in New Zealand, so he's across the pond, as we say, but I think it's taken quite a while to get there. So whilst I have it, I don't know if he does, but yes, we will get to that at some stage soon. But in any case, so I think this is a fairly good representation of where the Silmarillion stands in the 1950s, and in relation to the Lord of the Rings, I think this is the Silmarillion that sort of makes most sense to have. So a lot of scholars don't agree with that, but certain scholars like Gergai Nagy, who I've also interviewed before, which was a very interesting interview, sort of agrees with that opinion. So if you want to hear about that, you can go back and listen to that interview. But, he's of the opinion as well that this is sort of, this does represent Tolkien's, sort of writing, the development of the work at the time of the Lord of the Rings. So it's sort of the closest that we would get to something that coheres with the Lord of the Rings. So as I mentioned, Tolkien then went on in the 1960s to change, or at least to think about changing a whole lot of things, but of course never finished that later Silmarillion. And we might talk about that later as well, but for the most part we'd be considering this text. So that is sort of just some background. And of course today, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the Ainulindalë, which is the creation story in the Silmarillion, which is, I think it's important to note, a separate work to the Quenta Silmarillion, or the Tale of the Silmarils themselves, pardon me. And it was sort of conceived of as a separate work from the beginning, and the first, if you like, version of it was written back in the 1920s, I think early 1920s, or perhaps a little earlier than that. But again, the edition, or the version of the text that Christopher Tolkien relied on the most to generate the published text is that from 1951, which Christopher Tolkien sort of details in the book Morgoth's Ring, which is the one of the volumes of the History of Middle-earth series, where most of those original drafts of the 1950s Silmarillion are actually displayed. And there are several features of that text that are a little bit different in the published text. Most notably, the 1951 text still has a sort of a prelude from Tolkien explaining the sort of metatextual character of the story. That is that it's a work of sort of elvish law masters, to use the jargon. And this was something that Christopher excised from the published version, mainly because it's pretty clear that during the later 1950s and 60s, Tolkien abandoned the idea of using a sort of Anglo-Saxon mariner as a way of as a sort of mechanism for translating these texts. So originally it was sort of the idea that elves wrote this down, these sort of law masters, and then they communicated this story to a sort of Anglo-Saxon mariner, and then that's how it's sort of come down to us. Now later, Tolkien sort of ditched that, and really in the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, it's where he comes up with the idea of the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion as a kind of translation of Elvish material by Bilbo himself, and that somehow that's how it comes down to us. So it gets rid of this Anglo-Saxon idea, really, which had actually been around in some form since the 19 teens when Tolkien started writing, and it's really finally there that whole idea is sort of ditched in favour of a sort of Bilbo as the translator, Bilbo the Hobbit, of course, of this material. So I think we can imagine the Silmarillion then as a translation of Elvish texts, perhaps originally by Bilbo, but then they've sort of somehow, in the sort of fictional narrative or meta narrative, they've sort of somehow come down to Tolkien, the philologist, and he's translated Bilbo's translation into English. So that's how we might think about that. If we want to take the Lord of the Rings meta fictional frame as sort of canon, although I don't like that word in this context, but I think that's the best way to think about it anyway. I don't know if everyone will agree with that, if all scholars would agree with that, but that's certainly how I think about it. And even in that frame, we can still imagine that the work was originally, of course, conceived and written by certain Elvish scribes, if you like. But we just get rid of the whole connection to Anglo-Saxon England, which I've always thought is a bit of a clunky means of doing this. So that's a little bit of the background for the Silmarillion and the Ainulindalë, which of course we're going to focus on now. But before we do that, again, I feel like there's a lot of preambles here, but we're really going to start with, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to start with the letter to Wilton Waldman, and we're just going to consider a few things. We won't spend too much time on that, but I think it's worth considering a few features there. And of course, that letter is printed as a kind of introduction in the second edition of the Silmarillion, which honestly, if you go and buy it in a store now, is the edition that you will get. So most listeners, I imagine, will have that in their edition. And we are reading the Mariner / Shoot and Mifflin edition. That's the one that we're both looking at. Although, of course, it's published by HarperCollins as well. Although, if it's published by HarperCollins, you may have different page numbers to the page numbers that we refer to, which we may do here and there. But I think you'll be able to find the relevant areas at any rate. So I've talked for long enough, really, I guess. So Shrita, just by way of introducing this letter, or introducing our discussion of this letter, what were your general thoughts about it? What did you think was interesting about this?
Well, I thought it was interesting because it seemed to me that he was repudiating some of the cliches that people have about Tolkien pretty much right off the bat. And of course that opens up the question of how sincere or how at his word we should take him when he does that. So I'm not sure if you know what I'm talking about, but one example that I have underlined here is he says that he dislikes allegory.
Oh yeah,
and he goes on to talk about that. He says that I dislike allegory, the conscious and intentional allegory. That any attempt to explain the purport of myth or fairy tale must use allegorical language. And of course, the more life a story has, the more readily will it be susceptible of allegorical interpretations. Well, the better a deliberate allegory is made, the more nearly will it be acceptable just as a story. So, that seems to me, I mean, it's kind of a semantic splitting of the hairs, but it does seem to me that my understanding of the way that a lot of people approach Tolkien is almost as one giant allegory, and it seems here that his intention was to make much more of a kind of detailed story, or not just not a story in the sense that it's a narrative, but make a sort of detailed, just a detailed structure, I guess, of prose that's much more built from the bottom up rather than the top down. I guess that's maybe the best way I can picture it. I always had the impression that Tolkien was a very top down composer of his prose, but if we were to take him at his word, it seems like he was maybe working more bottom up than we know. But I don't know if we can take him at his word. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you're right. I mean, when you say bottom up, what do you sort of mean by that exactly?
Kind of just laying down interesting bricks and kind of seeing the structures built as they sort of appear, rather than coming top down with this enormous structure all planned out, and he's just sort of filling in the details, you know?
Oh yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, he says somewhere here that he feels like he's sort of discovering something that's already there, not so much inventing. I didn't highlight that, but I know it's here somewhere. Which is, an interesting way to think about creativity in the sort of creative process. I'm sure a lot of people who either write stories or even paint or, engage in some sort of artistic endeavor can relate to that idea.
Yeah, it makes me think of somewhere in an interview, Nabokov is being bombarded by all these questions about what does this story mean, and what did you mean to say when you wrote this, and he always used to just say that it means nothing more than the story itself. And when he was writing it, all he was doing, he wasn't thinking of these grand themes. He was just sort of collecting twigs and pebbles for a nest whose shape he had no idea of when he was collecting them, and the novel appears as as you write it. So, but that's a very artistic conception of making something that I wouldn't have necessarily ascribed to Tolkien. I would have thought that he had more of a plan, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Well, of course, when he's writing, say, the 1951 Silmarillion, that particular period of writing, he of course already has a general story, because he has before him the 1937 Silmarillion and then the Lost Tales versions of the stories, which of course are the first ones. So I guess the structure of the story doesn't really change, particularly between the 1920s and 50s. But of course, certain details are switched around, and certain ideas are elaborated on, etc., etc. So, yeah, he sort of, by the time we get to the material that's sort of compiled in this particular volume, he certainly has the story, and he's already been working on it for quite some time. So he's not
winging it.
Yeah, he's not winging it by this point.
Yeah.
But of course, as I've said, each new sort of iteration of the story introduces new elements, or changes something. Or I mean, what we're not sort of going to necessarily be doing a sort of compare and contrast in this podcast series, sort of between this Silmarillion and the sort of the 1937 text or anything like that, because I think that would just take us away from this text. But it is interesting to think about how how his sort of creativity works. So maybe it's a little disingenuous as a comment, but that is what Tolkien says here about sort of discovering things. I mean, of course he has a plan to some extent, or at least he has the stories already by this point. But I think there's something to be said for that sort of creative process, especially perhaps as he's thinking about that in the 1920s and 19-teens before that, when he's writing the unfinished tales, which I guess is what he's talking about here. But I think it says something suggestive about how his mind is working, I guess.
Yeah. Did you have any thoughts that you want to put out there about the letter?
Yeah, well, there's a few things I wanted to have a look at. I guess let's start with Tolkien's reasons for creating myth, or this myth in particular. And of course, this is a passage that's so often quoted in almost every book I've ever read about Tolkien. And here it's on page Roman numerals, I think. Sorry, let me find this. I think it's Roman numeral 12, right?
Yeah, that's if you're about to read what I think you're about to read, that's what I'm looking at on the
Roman
same
numeral
page.
12, yes. So it's this. I won't read it all out, but it's the quote that begins, "Do not laugh, but once upon a time, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legends, etc., etc." And this is quoted so often, so often that I almost don't want to talk about it because it's just so well known. But I think it's worth just highlighting what he writes here. He doesn't say he's going to make a mythology for England, which is usually what people say. He says he's going to dedicate it to England, and it should therefore possess a certain tone and quality, somewhat cool and clear, redolent of our air, and not classical myth and other areas, and possessing the fair elusive beauty of some that some call Celtic. It should be high, purged of the gross, whatever that means, and fit for a more adult mind, a land long and now steeped in poetry. And then he goes on to say how the cycle should be linked to a majestic whole, and then he says absurd. So, there's something a little bit self-effacing about this passage, which people don't always pick up on. And I think taking this at face value as a kind of creed of his creative output is a little bit, it misses the point, let's say, a little. I don't know what do you think? Because I think by the time he's writing The Lord of the Rings, I don't think he's writing a mythology really to dedicate to England particularly. I think he's doing something a little more expansive than that. And certainly...
Yeah, I interpreted that. So you're saying that people cite that as if he was trying to write a mythology of England?
Yeah, or for England,
For England?
Yeah.
I always just interpreted, I say always, I read this 6 months ago maybe when I don't remember when we started doing this, but when I read it last and when I read it this time too, I interpreted it as simply that he was writing a myth, and it was just going to be English. It was going to be like in its temperament, like he says, in its sort of like frame of reference, I guess, like broad frame of reference or broad sort of state of mind and sort of place in the sort of literary world was going to be like broadly English. But I don't even know. I don't know. Is that totally wrong of me?
No, I don't think it's wrong of you. I think a lot of people interpret the letter like that, or interpret that passage in that way, and sort of use it as evidence for this idea that he's sort of writing a mythology for England. I just think that by the time he gets to this point in his life where The Lord of the Rings is sort of almost done and he wants to publish the Silmarillion. Remember, this letter was written in, I think, also 1951, so it's about the same time that he's writing most of the material that is in the published book, published Silmarillion. Yes, 1951. So, and he's in fact trying to, he's thinking about trying to get it in a publishable form. So, I tend to think that by this point, and certainly by the 1960s and the later 1950s, I just think that he's not really writing a mythology necessarily with such a specific goal in mind. I think it sort of has a life and a character of its own, which may indeed be, as he put it, sort of, something with an elusive Celtic beauty. But I feel like that's definitely sort of more characteristic of how he's thinking about his first Silmarillion, which is the so-called Lost Tales book. Again, I know I keep saying that I don't want this to be a comparison thing, but then I keep bringing it up. That's my own fault. But I feel like he's sort of, they're describing his earlier project, his earlier creative project, and then sort of, as I said, he's being a bit self-effacing, or he's being a little bit self-conscious about it and saying, well, that's kind of absurd, isn't it? But, maybe I'm misinterpreting that. I mean, and then, he goes on to say, such an overweening purpose did not develop all at once. The mere stories were the thing. They arose in my mind as given. This is what we're talking about before. So again, page Roman numerals 12. As they came separately, so too the links grew, an absorbing, though continually interrupted labour. Yet I always had a sense of recording what is already there, somewhere, not inventing. So I think he's really talking here about his Lost Tales experience, the original Silmarillion. And then he talks about some of the other stories he had made up, The Hobbit, Giles of Ham, etc. And then on the next page he talks about allegory, which you mentioned before. And then he sort of goes on in the letter to, basically summarize the entire history of Middle Earth, sort of, together with his actual sort of writing process. So,
which I actually found very helpful, actually, as a
I think that's why I sort of included as an introduction, because it does sort of it does actually kind of summarize a lot of the material in a certain way, and I want to talk about that. But
just real quick before we get there, just to try to sort of summarize your point about that bit about the English myth. So basically, are you saying that maybe this is what the project was when he first embarked upon it, but as all projects do, as they grow larger and larger, they become more and more about themselves.
Yes,
and
I think that's
by the time that he was the time it had grown to that point, then it really can only be self-referencing. It got so large.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we see that in the Lord of the Rings, I think, because the Lord of the Rings just, as you said, sort of self-referencing. I mean, so much of its as I've spoken about with several guests, so much of its charm, that's not quite the right word, so much of its effect is precisely in its relationship to this earlier material, in a sort of a closed loop. So I think that's, by this point, Tolkien's writing has become self-referential enough such that the whole mythology for England idea sort of loses, I think anyway, it loses sort of meaning in not completely. There are certain ways that it's refracted in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits and in the Rohirrim, for example. But I think that becomes its own thing, as you put it.
Yeah.
So I mean that's my position.
I buy that actually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think in that passage, he's sort of, as I've mentioned, he's sort of he's trying to give an explanation of where this sort of arose out of, but then he's sort of saying that, well, maybe this was a little bit silly, and sort of this is how it's matured and come to pass. I mean, he doesn't say that explicitly, but that's my reading of it.
Yeah, that's fair.
But certainly one can take a different approach or a different opinion. So, I guess to move on then, I mean, as I mentioned, Tolkien then goes on in the letter to sort of explain the whole mythological cycle. And you mentioned that you found that useful, and it is useful. It is a useful summary just from that point of view. And for those of you who might be listening who haven't read Silmarillion, I would certainly recommend reading the letter in order to perhaps ease yourself into the book if you haven't already done so. But there's just a couple of areas I want to highlight before we get into the Ainulindalë, which I promise we will. On page numeral 13, Roman numeral 13, there's just a quote where he's talking about, I guess some of the thematic concerns of the whole cycle, the mythological cycle. And he says, anyway, all this stuff is mainly concerned with full mortality in the machine, which he capitalizes. With fall, inevitably, and that motive occurs in several modes, with mortality especially as it affects art and the creative desire, which seems to have no biological function, to be apart from the satisfactions of plain, ordinary biological life, with which in our world it is indeed usually at strife. That was the first sentence. I'm interested to know how you sort of take that that sentence. I'm not quite sure how to what to think about that.
Which sentence? Especially as it affects art and the creative or sub-creative desire. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually took a possibly totally off base but sort of wacky reading of it, which is that kind of similar to what we were saying about the Lord of the Rings. I think to some degree all great art is about art itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's all great art is sort of metatextual in some way, and kind of I had this sort of poetic image of everything that Tolkien wrote really just being about the art of writing and what it means to actually create something, from nothing, whether that's in the form of a creation myth or just, in writing some prose.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of thinking along those lines, and then also the kind of the idea that the making of something is necessarily the sort of destruction of it as well, right? The act of creation is an act of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of having ideas of that kind swirling around as well, that there may be some sort of inevitable entropy or destruction that sneaks into both the world and the creative process, and it's sort of a metaphor for his own state here, where he's really unable to finally sort of compile all together. I don't know if that's just a totally like up my own ass kind of reading, but that's just the kind of stuff that I had going on in my head when I was reading that.
No, I don't think so. I think there's something to that. I mean, yeah, obviously he didn't finish this Silmarillion, or any other Silmarillions in really in totality. So yeah, filled with this sense of mortality and yet unsatisfied by it. I mean, yeah, there's something there. I think, what he's saying here, and again, as we'll see going forward, a lot of his own gloss on his own work, a lot of his own commentary on his work often takes a sort of very theological flavor, as you might expect. He says, it may become possessive, clinging to the things made of its own. The sub-creator wishes to be the Lord and God of his private creation. And yeah, I can see, especially there, sort of talking about perhaps himself. He's sort of, he is sort of torn, or there's a tension between sort of his role as a kind of creator of this world and maybe his own theological beliefs. I don't know. He will rebel against the laws of the creator, especially against mortality. Both of these will lead to the desire for power, for making the will more quickly effective, and so to the machine or magic. So, and he intends by this external plans or devices that sort of coerce certain effects, particularly, I suppose, with regard to this idea of mortality and trying to sort of overcome it. Yeah, and that has, I guess, obvious sort of parallels in his own creation here. But no, that seems to be sort of setting up the sort of theological character of the book, at least how he thinks about it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I almost had this image of him as Melkor, actually. There's already like a thing going on, and he's interjecting his own sort of desire to be individual and vain into it, by sort of writing this world into being. That's obviously not. There's no basis for that, but it's just a sort of funny image that I had when I read, particularly that paragraph. I was imagining him as Melkor.
Yeah, well, as I said, there is sort of this tension between. He seems to feel it himself, this sort of creating this world, and therefore being in some sense its master, and sort of having some sense of guilt or something about that, and perhaps that explains his sort of self-effacement that I've talked about before, and we see that in sort of other letters of Tolkien as well, and of course it is a major theme in the work, as we will definitely see. So,
what do you think about that paragraph?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think it's just an interesting insight, I suppose, as you've said, into his mind and perhaps some of the tensions that are perhaps a little bit below the surface there. And of course, he's writing this letter, we must remember, to a publisher to sort of get the Silmarillion published. And perhaps had this publisher said yes, perhaps he would have actually finished it because he'd have some reason to. But so he's trying to sort of explain himself, and so he's not being too frank, I think, but perhaps in between the lines, as you were, if you read between the lines, there are hints of sort of difficulty, creative uncertainties, perhaps as you've sort of hinted at. Perhaps. Go on.
That's interesting to keep in mind that I forgot that the publisher didn't end up publishing this. I for some reason I had in my head that it never got published, but it was because Tolkien never finished it.
Well,
I didn't realize that the publisher rejected it.
Yeah, that's right. At this point, so had the publisher not rejected it, maybe he would have finished it at this point, because he would have had a deadline or something,
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So there's some. There's interesting possibilities there to read into that letter.
It's more of a pitch than I realized. I think I was reading this as almost a letter to a friend who happened to be a publisher. But
it's more of a pitch. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to keep in mind for the next time I read it.
And I think on that note, just on a more general level, it's been placed in the second edition of this book as an introduction, but I guess I'm interested in thinking about how that really works. This is the author writing, again, to a publisher, a prospective publisher. It's not actually written as an introduction to the book for general readers. So how does this maybe colour our approach to the book or colour our interpretation? Because we're not just getting a summary here. I think we're also getting a sort of theologico-ideo-political a reading of the text from Tolkien himself, which, of course, some people will take as simply authoritative. But is that how we should approach the letter, do you think, as a kind of introduction? This is not, for example, like an introduction written in, say, a Penguin Classics edition where you'll get some scholar to write a sort of lengthy introduction. Now, those are, of course, partial themselves, but you can more easily see that because, of course, the author isn't writing the introduction. Usually it's some other scholar or something quite distant from the author in time and space, who is sort of writing their, some background material, but also perhaps giving some interpretive material as well. But it's always obvious that one doesn't have to sort of take at face value what this person is saying. So should we treat this letter the same way, do you think? I tend to think we should, because I don't necessarily think that we have to just sort of take at his word of everything that's written here, especially considering the context of this, as a letter, as a pitch, as you put it.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I think we maybe have talked before about my position as an interpreter of musical compositions puts me in a position where I often I often think that the composer's opinion on how his piece or her piece should go is just one opinion. It's an interesting opinion, but it's not by any means authoritative. And and oftentimes I found that the composer doesn't understand their piece as well as the performers do anyway, because there's a kind of myopia that one needs to have when one is making something that maybe makes you lose track of some things that a scholar or someone taking a sort of purely interpretive aspect can take. So it's always a trade-off, and I always think that it's an interesting opinion. Maybe weight it 1.5 times or something, but it's by no means authoritative, and I take it with many cloves of garlic, as it were. To me, it's purely interesting, and just it's good to know what maybe he had in his head, or what he thought he had in his head, or what he would like people to think that he had in his head. But that hardly colors my interpretation at all. I don't know.
Good.
What do you think?
Well, that's good. I mean, yeah, I agree with that. I just think it's as I mentioned before, it's so often quoted as a kind of not just that passage that we looked at, but it's so often quoted as a as a piece of evidence for various positions, and I think that's fine. But I think we need to just have some awareness about what it's doing. It's not written as an introduction. It's written as a letter for a very specific person. It's not written for general readers, although it can function in that way. As you said, you found the sort of summaries interesting. But that's something to keep in mind. And we might come back to that as we go on. So we'll see how we go.
Yeah.
All right. And I think just one point to make on that letter, actually. I mentioned before that so much of this material was actually first conceived back in the 19-teens and 1920s, and although there are certain shifts and changes that do take place over time, obviously, in the shape of these stories and in certain features, in general, a lot of it is there in the 20s. So a lot of that creativity, that initial creativity, is something that he's talking about in retrospect. So we're not necessarily getting an insight into Tolkien as he was in the 20s or 30s. We're getting an insight into what he's thinking about the text in 1951, which, if you've read, for example, again, the Nature of Middle-earth book is somewhat different to how he's thinking about these texts in the 1960s. Things get progressively more theological. Basically, he gets more sort of worried about how his vision can be interpreted theologically and how closely it matches sort of various Catholic ideas. And, obviously a lot of religious readers are going to like that. I myself don't like that. I think that he loses a lot of his creative impetus when he starts doing that very, very forcefully in the 1960s. But that's, I guess, a conversation for another day. But I think here in the Silmarillion, published Silmarillion, we're sort of in the middle of that process, and we get something that still reflects the sort of the creative impulses that he had in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s when he's really creating this stuff for the first time. And I think the 1951 Silmarillion is a kind of, it's a nice, which, as I mentioned, which is mostly what this text is. It is a nice, encapsulation of sort of that creative process up to that point. And I think much of what comes after that, tends towards, well, I don't want to say anything too mean, but it tends towards ossification, but also one sort of ossifies his creative impulses into the stories that have already been written, or otherwise takes them in certain directions which limit the creativity that he has left. But I don't know. That's a discussion for another day. But I can't even remember what my point was. I was going off on a tangent. But
I can't remember either.
Yeah.
But I would tend to agree that tends to happen with people who are working on something for that long. It's a long time.
Yeah,
and I think it's easy to sort of get in your own head and get too top down, maybe. Like,
yeah, well, that definitely starts happening, I think. Anyway, I will talk about that with Daniel when we have our review of the book, The Nature of Middle-earth book.
I think a literary example of that could be something like Finnegan's Wake,
Oh, yeah. Okay. I mean, I haven't read that or tried to read it, and I'm never going to.
Yeah.
But, yeah, perhaps.
It's something where he starts out with some interesting ideas and he plays around with them and it's interesting, but then, it's festering in his mind for a couple of decades or however long he worked on it. By the end, it's gibberish because he just tried to impose a structure on it that it couldn't possibly hold.
Yeah.
But at least the Lord of the Rings, not the Lord of the Rings, at least all of the Middle-earth stuff continues to be readable.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, you can certainly pass its sentences fairly easily in most cases.
Should we get to the?
Yes, we should get to the Ainulindalë. Sorry, so that's a whole lot of background. For those, so hopefully listeners have maintained interest, but I think it's important to mention some of that and discuss that letter. So yes, Ainulindalë, right, the creation story. So let's just get into it, I guess. Sort of first of all, what did you think? What were your first thoughts about the story as a whole, about the creation myth?
I love it. I love the fact that it's a musical creation myth.
I thought you might like that. Yeah.
And I don't know if that's unique. I'm not versed in all of the world's mythological traditions, but I don't know of any other one like that, and I like it. It's just, it charms me. So
yeah.
Yeah.
It does have a certain charm to it. Yes. I agree. Yeah. So sorry, go on. Yep.
No, I was just thinking of like a sort of topic to get it rolling. But if you have something, if you have a direction you want to take it in, you should go for it.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say that, we have this sort of, I guess, a 3-act structure in a sense. There's the music of the Ainur, so they sort of sing in a sort of heavenly choir, if you like. Then there's a vision that they're given of the world, which seems like a visual, sort of given in visual terms. So we have sort of music, and then we have something more painterly maybe. And then we have, of course, the account of the creation itself. So we see that there's been a vision, there's been a sort of history that's been somehow woven, but it needs to be actually made. And then that's when the Valar, or the certain Ainur, come into the earth and sort of actually do what, the sort of actual physical making that one might expect of as pantheon of gods. And that, they sort of raise mountains and make the seas and whatever. And they create, or they attempt to create anyway, this very symmetrical sort of world, it seems. So we have the 2 great lamps, which sort of takes us into the first chapter of the Silmarillion a bit, but eventually we have these 2 great lamps which give light to the world. So we don't yet have the sun and moon, and the Valar sort of live in the middle continent, what becomes Middle Earth, but of course, throughout this process, we have this character Melkor who's always disrupting things. So there's so many places we could start, but I guess I wanted to start with Melkor and what's going on with Melkor here. So I don't know. In my notes, I've got sort of this question of motives. Do you think it makes sense to talk about motives here, or are we on such a sort of abstract mythical plane that perhaps talking about such elemental forces that we can't ascribe motives to a character like Melkor? But it seems like the text at least sort of partially does that. I don't know. What did you think?
I think, sorry.
That's right.
My book dropped. As it were. I think one must try to ascribe motives to certainly Melkor, to I think everyone, including Iluvatar. I think.
Yeah.
I'm even inclined to read the Old Testament and ascribe motives to God.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think it encourages you to do that, at least, some level.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not even sure what the argument for not having for not thinking of motives is? I didn't quite understand. Could you sort of walk me through, like maybe try to steel man that argument?
Sure, yeah.
For the sake of this podcast.
Sure, yeah. Well, I guess I'm not arguing that we shouldn't think about motives. It's just, should we treat these characters as sort of more elemental forces, or should we treat them as personalities in and of themselves? Because I feel like sometimes, of course, they take on the sort of attributes of certain elemental forces, especially when they come down to the earth itself to make it. But yeah, that was all I was thinking. It's not a major point or anything, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's one thing I really like about the Hellenistic view of myth, which I think is passed down into Judaism and is kind of lost in Christianity and Islam. But
yeah,
the part that's interesting is that the gods and the goddesses are they occupy like a sort of a chimeral role, right? They're both elemental forces, and they get involved in these sort of petty human disputes, and it's kind of present in some degree in the Hindu myths as well, like
yes.
that. That they are.
I want to ask
gods,
you about that.
But they do get sort of embroiled in petty disputes and stuff like that, and I think that's. There's no conflict there in my mind, that's one thing I appreciate. That I think he has, at least in his creation story, he has sort of flaunted the Christian tradition in that sense.
I definitely agree. Yeah, and certainly as you note, I think we can take the Valar, especially as characters. But perhaps you mentioned Ilúvatar, this sort of the Allfather, if you like, which he was called in some of the earlier editions, to mention the earlier ones again. Which sort of
do a token pod drinking game where you
every time I mention the earlier Silmarillion text. But you mentioned that we can think about Ilúvatar too as a character, and of course many readers just take Ilúvatar to be sort of equivalent to the Abrahamic God, which perhaps in Tolkien's mind he is, but as a character, what is he? I think his motives here are quite different to the Christian God, if we can ascribe motives to the Christian God, for example. But what seems to be motivating the creation of the world here in this myth, do we think? Sorry, I don't want this to sound like an interview. Just put questions back at me if you...
Well, I mean, that's a question that I would have back at you, because I have no answer to that question. I do have, maybe if we get to it later, some of the motives that he might have for the way that he treats Melkor, and generally, has this sort of once the world is created. But as for the creation of the world, no, that's going to have to be all you.
Well, I don't know. For me, I feel like his motive is sort of artistic, right? It's aesthetic. He wants to sort of create this world as a kind of a drama or something, which is really suggested by the Theodicy that's in this text, where on page 17, that is Arabic numerals, page 17. He says once Melkor has sort of introduced his own discordant theme in the music, Ilúvatar says, "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Ilúvatar, these things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme, dyslexic today, may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." So there's a certain sense there that Ilúvatar is, obviously in ultimate control, but that there's perhaps there's a sense also that it's everything that sort of happens is part of the plan on some level, and it's all sort of redounding to some sort of dramatic, aesthetic outcome. I guess what I'm interested here is I feel less in this version, for example, against the Christian story, for example. I don't feel like Iluvatar is motivated by sort of goodness or something like that. He seems to be motivated by a kind of, as I said, sort of aesthetic impulse, which makes sense for Tolkien. I think this is a very sort of Tolkienian story, obviously, but in that sense that, as we were talking about in terms of the letters, he's sort of on some level obsessed with creativity and the creative impulse, as we'll see in the book, because that's what the whole book is about, really. So that's sort of how I take it. He has this, and then of course that's perhaps supported by this idea, as you mentioned, that of course the first act of this story is the music, the great music. So yeah, I don't know how you would think about that. But.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Would you say it? I would have another question for you, which is maybe a sort of it's just like a thought experiment, I guess, about ethics, but yeah, there is definitely a sense that the Odyssey is dealt with here in a much more honest way than I think it is in the Christian myth, where you can almost imagine Iluvatar saying, maybe bone cancer in children does suck, but it is all part of this sort of divine vision that I've had. That's really stretching it. But whereas in the Christian myth, there's some place where you have to sort of square the circle of this being ultimately something that's done for good, right? For some sort of ethical good, which is not even sort of being put into the question, really. I think it's easy to maybe, I don't know if there's anything in the text to support that, but it doesn't seem like he's really, like you're right, he's not really concerned with
well, if we take the character, if we take the character of the text here and forget about Christian / other kinds of religious, and I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm just saying a lot of people do this, they sort of treat Iluvatar as a biblical figure, but it's like, well, let's just take him as a character in this text. I just don't think we have evidence that he's sort of motivated, as you say, by goodness, or, it's not like God saw the world was good, right? It's not, there's not some sense that, there's a sense that it's aesthetically pleasing, that the music is somehow beautiful, and there's a glory in it. He says, and thou, Melkor, wilt discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind, and wilt perceive that they are but a part of the whole and tributary to its glory. There's a sense that this is something like the Stoic universe. It's a kind of holistic, what's the word I'm looking for? Not mechanism, but organism. That's the word I'm looking for. And that somehow, and we'll see this when the world was first created, there's some sense that it's sort of first created with a kind of symmetry in mind. It's, there are certain aesthetic characteristics, not ethical characteristics, which it seems imbued with. Now you might say, well, Tolkien is equating aesthetic characteristics with ethical characteristics and saying, well, beauty is sort of beautiful things are sort of good by default, but I don't know if this really, that idea really works with the Odyssey, because as you say, it's not sort of saying that everything that works out is going to be good. It's saying that everything that works out is somehow going to redound to the glory of this creation. In a sort of aesthetic sense. So, maybe that's a circle that can't be squared, or a square that can't be circled.
Maybe. I'm inclined to agree with you, though, that I think that you could do that kind of a beauty equals good sort of association, but that's extra textual. And even, one striking comparison to just right in the very first few lines, I don't know if this was intentional, but there's a parallel to the phrase, and it was good, right? And but here he says, and they sang before him and he was glad. That's there's a sort of resonance there, but it's one that's more maybe narcissistic, for lack of a better word, or it's just more it's like you said, it's this, he's creating this thing that's
sort of,
it's more self-serving. I'm only coming up with negative words, but
I know what you mean. I feel like Iluvatar is like like an advanced like a really advanced AI or something, and he's sort of thinking about, what's sort of an aesthetically beautiful simulation that I can make, and I feel like there's something like that,
Yeah. And if I happen to set off, 5,000 years of horror, then so be it. It'll all be
sort of dramatically interesting in the end, anyway.
Yeah.
And that's why, thinking about this, this story, I don't know, thinking about sort of comparative examples. As a myth, it's interesting because it has this sort of monotheistic feature. And of course, what most people think about when they think about this is this sort of tension between the monotheism and the Valar, who, of course, these pantheon of gods. And I know some people have sort of, when I say people, I don't know, perhaps I've read it on Reddit or something, I can't think exactly, but, I know I've seen comments somewhere that sort of suggest that, he's trying to have his cake and eat it, as it were. He's trying to have a sort of monotheism and also sort of just import a kind of polytheism as well. So he sort of mashes the two together. But I think it does create an interesting, in my mind, it creates an interesting dynamic in the story, which is fairly unique, I think, to this mythology, which is that, you have this sort of creative, the world begins as this creative sort of act, this very aesthetic act, as we've sort of mentioned. And then we have these beings who are sort of, presumably Ilúvatar is in some sense omniscient, right? He seems at least to be omniscient, if not quite omnibenevolent in that really very ethical sense. But then, the world is actually sort of created by these much less, but by these not omniscient beings. What's the opposite of omniscient? Who sort of have to go into the world and actually do the creating, itself. And as we'll see in the Silmarillion, they face all sorts of sort of dilemmas, and some of them ethical, some of them just sort of prudential or procedural, and they don't always make the right choices and whatever. But their role in the story is sort of interesting as well, and we'll get to that, and sort of why they become necessary. It seems to be in order to perhaps on some level to facilitate the drama of history, right? I don't know.
Yeah, and it also begs the question of who's really the creator here. I mean, that's it does seem like the Valar are doing all the heavy lifting here.
Yeah. I mean, as Ilúvatar says, he says, "Behold your music." He doesn't say my music. "This is your minstrelsy, and each of you shall find contained herein, amid the design that I set before you, all those things which it may seem that he himself devised or added." That's right before page 17 again. So, again, it introduces this interminable debate between fate and free will in Middle-earth, which I feel is like a distraction, but it's sort of, what I like about this story is it doesn't resolve any of those sort of paradoxes of theology, right, that people talk about in terms of real-world religion, but it sort of expresses them in a sort of pleasing and interesting way, by having this sort of creative figure. But perhaps there are also these other figures who, as you say, do all of the hard work, and there's sort of a distance between the creator and the world. There's a theodicy, but it's not quite a theodicy. Perhaps it's not so much related to the ethics of the situation. I don't know.
There's something there where I think if you make something that's sort of beautiful and detailed enough that it's going to end up dealing with the same questions, and maybe those questions are on some level not answerable by literature, right? Maybe these are. I'm not saying that. I'm hesitant to say that anything is an unanswerable question. But maybe it's just something that can't be resolved aesthetically, which whatever, whether it's the Holy Bible or whether it's the Silmarillion, they're attempting to solve these problems by the same method, and maybe it simply can't be done in any sort of intuitive aesthetic way. So I could imagine a lesser writer really trying to set out to solve some of the problems that theology poses, and the creation story that would come out would be crap. The reason that this holds up with other creation stories of the world is because it is similarly non-conclusive and sort of I keep saying this today, but bottom up, right? So there's something there.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe what you mean by that is it reads as though it is sort of given as an answer, not the answer, by a cultural tradition, right? Which is really what it is conceived as in the secondary world, or in the story world. I don't know if that's quite what you mean, but yeah.
It is. I think that's something that is maybe a little bit harder to do. I could imagine it being harder to do than it seems, right? It's almost, I'm not sure if this is a perfect analogy, but it's almost like if you're teaching a student, to play an instrument or something, sometimes you try to imitate what they're doing, right? They're doing badly. And that's actually sometimes really, really hard to do because you need to be really in control of what you're doing to recreate a mistake in a precise way. So I think it maybe is harder than I might be giving him credit for, to just make something that reads as if it could have been a legitimate creation myth, because to do so in the 20th century, it would be maybe too tempting to try to answer too many of the questions that, or just maybe put too much of a bow on it.
And maybe this, I don't know, I've mentioned Plato in the notes, but maybe this has something more in common with Plato's aesthetics than it does with sort of biblical accounts of God's creative process. Sorry for that. That break there. I'm just having a look at my notes, but I don't know. I feel almost that in sort of singing the world into being, as we've discussed, again, that brings us back to this sort of artistic idea. Singing the world into being, though, generates a kind of, to use Platonic idea, to use Platonic language, kind of idea of the world, right? There's this sort of abstract idea, this abstract notion in music somehow, however we sort of understand that, right? And then, as I mentioned, it's sort of given a painterly aspect in a vision. It's called a vision. And then it's actually, as we've mentioned, it's sort of, they actually go down and, sort of sift through the dirt, as it were, to build up the mountains and the towers. But it sort of starts in this Platonic way with this vision. I don't know if I don't know if there's much to say about that, but perhaps it relates back to this idea of the aesthetic sort of part of this creation, or the aesthetic motive of this impulse of this creation, and sort of beauty as, again, a kind of idea or a form. And I don't know if that sort of raises anything for you, but
so the two things that I'm thinking of is that Plato is on the mind, but actually precisely because he does make the kind of beauty equals good, or beauty equals virtue. Maybe.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of thinking about. Yeah.
Connection, and even to the point where didn't he have problems with certain harmonies or certain chords being played because they were dissonant? I think he actually did associate dissonant chords with evil. Which,
exactly.
is made literal here. Or not literal.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But there's also a resonance to Genesis, I think, in that it's always interested me that the author of Genesis, whoever that may be. I read somewhere that it could be someone that they call Jay, who's like the wife of King Solomon or something. But it's always interesting that whoever the author of Genesis is has two stabs at the creation myth, right?
That's right. Yeah.
There is the first, and it kind of follows a similar thing, which is the first one, which is very abstract. It's a kind of universal creation myth, and then in the second one, excuse me, God is anthropomorphized, and again he's literally walking through the world that he's created, and he fashions Adam out of clay. It's a much more sort of in the dirt, literally, and so it's interesting that there are two stabs at creation, and I wonder if there's something in creation myths where you have to deal with this problem where, you know, you do have to create the world, and you have to abstractly create the world, but then you actually have to make the things that people see around in the world. So
absolutely.
I wonder if it's more common than not to have two cracks at it. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's particularly interesting. I'd love to get a Plato scholar. I'm not a Plato scholar on to actually talk about.
By no means am I.
To talk about some of those. It's been a while since I've not read the Timaeus, which is his sort of creation myth. Actually, that would be interesting as a comparison. Perhaps we can do that at some stage. Yeah. But you know, I know that certain comparisons have been made in the scholarship between sort of Neoplatonic ideas and the Ainulindalë here. So that might be something worth. You know, I'm sure there's readers out there who are more knowledgeable on Plato who are sort of thinking of a whole lot of parallels and perhaps interesting differences as well. But there's something that struck me there, and of course, beauty as a form is sort of the highest form, right, for Plato, I think. I know I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's the good, or maybe they're the same thing. I'm not sure. But it's been a while since I've read Plato. But
yeah, that's way above my pay grade. So
I mean, just reading the Stanford Encyclopedia on Plato's aesthetics, it does say that. So beauty's unmatched pedagogical effects when transfers shows why Plato talks about its goodness and good consequences, sometimes even its identity with the good in the Laws Republic Symposium. But the relationship between the beautiful and the good in the Symposium is controversial. Okay. Yeah, so there's some relationship there. And it'd be interesting to know what that controversy sort of the desirable effects also explain why Plato speaks grudgingly of beauty in art and poetry. Another question matters more than either poetry or beauty does. What leads the mind towards knowledge of the forms? Anyway, that's all. Plato's weird relationship to poetry, but yeah. So okay, there is some perhaps controversy over that, and I feel like we've been talking about in this discussion. I feel like there is a tension in this story, in this particular mythological or mythologized vision. There is a kind of tension perhaps between the beauty and the good. I don't know. Do you think that's a conclusion we can come to, or do you think that's, I don't know.
I guess, I don't know if, I didn't pick up on any tension between beauty and good. My reading is purely that I assumed that Tolkien himself was making the beauty equals good kind of, like the sort of, extra textual sort of assumption.
Okay.
That it also made, or maybe controversially made, I don't know. And that I was just reading it, kind of eliminating that and just sort of reading it as purely aesthetic creation myth. But I didn't, maybe because I was reading it too single-mindedly, I didn't pick up on any, I didn't pick up on any dissonance between those ideas, you know.
That's fair enough. I think
it's, if you told me that Tolkien was equating beauty and good, it seemed like I could believe that. That's what I assumed, you know.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. I don't know. I guess I'm struck by the focus on the beauty as opposed to the good in the story. At least in this creation myth. I mean, we can get into the good later. I don't know, but yeah, it's not necessarily contradictory or anything. I mean, now
that you pointed out that one paragraph of the one that you read earlier, And thou, Melkor, shall see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost coursing meet. Now that you pointed that out, and particularly the context that you read it in, I'm more receptive to that.
I certainly don't think you're wrong in reading, just sort of taking it as given that the beauty sort of is equivalent to the good in this context. But I guess,
or rather, I was just eliminating the good,
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. You were sort of having.
It's like there's like two layers where I assume that that's what Tolkien was thinking, but I just choose to delete that part because I like it more as an aesthetic reading. And I think, to be fair, as far as I know, in the text, all we have to go off of is the aesthetic reading, right?
Well, I guess that's what interests me about this is that it sort of. It's sort of, and I keep using this word, but it really aestheticizes the creation to a degree that's sort of, for me anyway, I don't think present in, say, a Genesis or some other creation myths. I mean, you could certainly say, well, God thinks the world is good in Genesis, therefore he thinks it's beautiful. That there's a sort of aesthetic reading. But again, that comes back to whether or not there's a sort of distinction. I don't know. Anyone who's listeners, what do you think? Write to us and tell us what you think on Twitter, or our Reading Tolkien Facebook group, which hopefully one day will be a group, but you can join us there. But I think it's interesting that I guess either reason or either reading rather is perhaps plausible.
Yeah, I think again that's what makes it good. A more closed off reading would have made it lesser. A more closed off writing of it made it a lesser tale.
Yeah. What I find interesting is for such a often moralistic writer, especially in The Lord of the Rings, where obviously sort of moral sides are drawn very starkly, it's interesting here that although yes, we have Melkor and we have Ilúvatar and the other Valar, sort of there's that distinction between them. It's nonetheless all somehow redounding to the beauty of the whole. That's sort of given as we mentioned as a theodicy that somehow undermines that. If we want to make an ethical distinction, it kind of undermines it because if it redounds to the beauty of the whole, then can we really make an ethical distinction there? It's all just part of the drama. I don't know.
Well, there's also something where we've definitely talked about the connection to Milton before, but I always find it fascinating that Milton almost seems to. I mean, I have no doubt that he believes in the Christian myth, but
sure, yeah,
he seems to subvert it more than you might think if you hadn't actually read him in his treatment of Lucifer. I think it's more of a heroic. He's more of a figure that wants to be pitied and it wants to sort of he draws him in sort of heroic. In heroic gestures. And I think that there's something to that with Melkor too. He's not presented as purely wretched or just this sort of unimpeachable evil or even just something pathetic. There's something to be there's something with Melkor where we actually, at least I do, immediately kind of associate with something fundamental to our humanity in Melkor, and I think Milton does the same thing with Lucifer, where there's something in the way that it's every man for himself and God against all, right? It's I think there's a fundamental part of being a human that is a rebellion against the creation for having been brought into it, maybe, and the only people that you see, it's an odd treatment to give a sort of heroic characterization to someone who's flaunting, everything. But Milton does that with Lucifer, and I think Tolkien does that with Melkor, and I think that there's something there. I think if it were as ideological as sometimes he purports to be, and certainly other people make him out to be, then I don't think you would get that kind of a sort of subtle treatment. I don't know if you have anything to riff on with that.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly is a sort of Miltonic figure, at least here. He becomes sort of pathetic later on, but at least here he does have a sort of not quite heroic, but relatable motives, maybe, which brings us back to a question which I guess is interesting. And of course, what I sort of highlighted here was that Melkor is ashamed after he sort of does his own, has his sort of discordant phase, and then he's filled with shame, and then out of the shame comes a secret anger. And so this is what seems to generate his sort of later, or his fall, if you like. It's not simply that he sort of creates a discord and wants to go off on his own, but it's that somehow he's ashamed of it, and therefore somehow out of the shame comes anger. I don't know. Does that strike you as psychologically plausible?
It did. It struck me as not just plausible, but very sort of, I hate the word relatable, but very it was something I certainly didn't pick up on when I was a kid, but it brought to mind the wonderful phrase by Christopher Hitchens that that we are created evil and commanded to be well.
Yeah, I mean that's
created sick and commanded to be well, and
sick and commanded to be well.
And there's something there with Iluvatar does create everything and all the Ainur, and he does say everything that you do is still beholden to me, and yet Melkor is being shamed for this thing, which he has been created as such. So again, we have these problems of free will that no creation method can really solve. But there's something there where there's some sense in which Iluvatar is creating Melkor sick and commanding him to be well, or at the very least, what do you call it? He's not threatening him, but he's basically out riffing him in a jam sesh.
I mean, again, it comes back to this notion, this theodicy of sort of everything that you do sort of just redounds to the glory of the creation, which suggests that the free will is kind of a sham, right? Anyway, because if free will were actually, if it was something sort of ontologically, if you like, meaningful, then surely it would actually have an effect on the world in some sort of tangible way. But apparently, at least according to this myth, and I think by the way that the later stories kind of just undermine this whole idea anyway, but at least according to this myth, it doesn't sort of matter what choices anyone makes. It all just sort of redounds to some sort of aesthetic, vision or whole, which is just made more glorious by anything that sort of happens, So, and I think in the first chapter of the Silmarillion proper, I think it is, we're given just to skip ahead briefly, we're given maybe it's in the Ainulindalë, we're given the example of a snowflake, which sort of, and I'll just read page 36, 37. In the overthrow of the mighty pillars, so Melkor comes into the world and overthrows the great lamps, which I mentioned before are sort of the first sources of light. Illumin and Ormal. In the overthrow of the mighty pillars, lands were broken and seas rose in tumult, and when the lamps were spilled, destroying flame was poured out over the earth, and the shape of Arda and the symmetry of its waters and its lands were marred at that time. So we've got this idea of sort of symmetry, which is related to sort of aesthetic values, not so much moral values. So the first designs of the Valar were never after restored. And then we sort of also get, as part of this kind of ideological myth of sort of volcanism and other sort of features of the earth. Just trying to find, talks about the snowflakes, but anyway, we can come back to that. But we see that, there's this idea of original symmetry, and then that's sort of broken, just like in physics, right? And then
Wait, just like is there really such a thing as that in physics?
Oh, like the symmetries of various forces of nature and stuff. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sure that's a thing.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Again, not an expert on that, but
yeah, far from it. I'm still recovering from my D in high school physics.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah, so I don't know. Melkor sort of does these things and apparently has this free will, but then it sort of, at least in the Ainulindalë myth, sort of seems to me that anyway that's sort of rendered meaningless because we're left with this sort of vision of splendor and beauty. For example, the snowflake, which is sort of created by the ices of Melkor. I was trying to find the quote, but I can't see it right now. But and so this new beautiful thing comes out of this clash of forces that sort of Melkor initiates by his discord. And so the snowflake is an example of this new thing, which is not imagined, by the Valar. But it's this beautiful thing. So, that only comes about because of this clash, which suggests to me that Melkor's, betrayal, if you like, sort of part of the plan all along, and that's actually the drama. That's what's. Now, again, I keep trying to argue for this kind of this aesthetic reading of the text, but yeah, sort of divorced from the good, right? But
yeah,
I don't know. Yeah. Otherwise, I think.
I mean,
an ethic.
I agree with that.
I feel like.
Sorry, yeah.
No, sorry. I feel like an ethical reading just introduces too many contradictions between. In the sort of fate and free will debate, if you take it, which is interesting. I think at the very least, I think it's interesting that Tolkien seems to be emphasizing that and playing around with it.
Yeah, I haven't thought it through as much as you have. I just my preference for the aesthetic reading is purely aesthetic.
Yeah, but no, I think it has some. I think it has some textual reason.
Yeah.
Well, there's some textual reason there for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is convincing. So,
well,
to me at least.
Yeah. Well, any listeners, I'd love to know. For those listening, what you think. This is kind of an interesting question, I think. Is the good equivalent to the beautiful, or should we take them as sort of separate Platonic forms that don't always, can't always be equated? So,
in real, I mean,
yeah,
I don't know if you have any other. I have to get going relatively soon here.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah.
Would it be interesting to have a quick riff on whether that's true in real life? I think
sure.
I know your answer. But
sure.
Unless you have any other things to talk about the Ainulindalë. Is that how you say it?
Yeah. No, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think?
I'd say no. Yeah. What would you say?
I'd say it's pretty self-evidently no, but yeah. I think it's maybe cheating because it's informed by our general lack of belief and and God, I can easily imagine someone who's more theologically oriented that that they would answer the question differently.
One could easily say, I suppose, that in our sort of fallen world, the beauty is not always equated with the good because the world is, to use Tolkien's terminology, marred. But one could say that, well, the pure forms of the beauty and the good are in fact one and the same thing. One could, I suppose, argue that. Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, I think, we'll have to get a philosopher on.
Yeah.
I think for now, that's a good discussion. I think, for any readers who've not read for any listeners who've not read the Ainulindalë, I would recommend it. And of course, hopefully you enjoyed that discussion. I think we covered quite a bit. There's of course a great deal more that one could talk about with regards to the Ainulindalë, but I think that discussion about the extent of or the sort of motives of God in creating the world are of course of interest to believers in the real sense, and this sort of myth gives perhaps another answer to that, or at least it suggests something about an answer. But is there anything you wanted to say to close things out, or?
Not really. I think that was my piece said.
Yeah.
Looking forward to the next bit.
Yeah, cool. So hopefully, if readers were interested in that discussion, feel free to look us up on Twitter, which is probably at the moment the main way of contacting us, and that is sorry, I've got to find it again. What is it again? It's it's at Pod Reading.
You don't know your own handle?
Sorry?
No, sorry.
It's at Pod Reading, and you'll find us there. And I also have a Substack, which is sort of the Substack for reading Tolkien. So it's called Reading Tolkien. Yeah, it's just called Reading Tolkien Substack. And we post, I'm going to post these tutorials. I was just teaching tutorials, so I have that in my mind. These podcasts on there, and all the other podcasts are now on there, as well as some other stuff I've just been writing, but which is sometimes to do with Tolkien, sometimes not. But that's another place to respond. I think for now they're the two main places. There is a Facebook group too, if you want to join that. So anyone who's interested in that debate, please contact us there. So I think we can finish that off there. So thanks again, and I think that was interesting. Yeah, hopefully I didn't talk too much.
No, that was good.
All right, cool. All right, thanks everyone, and we'll be back next time with the next few chapters, and I'll post on the Twitter exactly what. Yeah, we haven't decided yet exactly where we'll get up to, but we'll post that. So thanks everyone, and do get in touch if you want to contribute to that discussion. So thank you, and we'll see you later.